4 years after my husband Michael disappeared, a dog brought me the jacket he wore that fateful day. The fog rolled thick across my porch, reminiscent of that morning in October when he left for his usual hiking trip in the rugged cliffs of Caldera Ridge. Pouring my morning coffee, still 2 cups, a ritual I couldn't let go, I noticed a figure in the mist. A shepherd mix emerged, lean but strong, his amber eyes locked onto me. Hanging from his mouth was something familiar, a weathered green jacket. My breath hitched as the coffee mug slipped from my hand, shattering on the wooden floor. It was Michael's favorite jacket, the one he wore the day he vanished. Hands trembling, I opened the screen door. The dog didn't bolt. He stood, unflinching, holding the jacket as though it carried a message only he could deliver. Where did you get that?" My voice was barely a whisper. The dog approached, mud caked on his paws, his fur matted with twigs and burrs. As he dropped the jacket at my feet, I sank onto the porch steps, clutching the worn fabric. Memories crashed over me, Michael slipping it on, kissing me goodbye, promising he'd be home by sunset. Days turned into weeks of fruitless searching, the helicopters and rescue teams eventually giving way to a hollow funeral. A scrap of paper fluttered from the jacket pocket. My fingers shook as I unfolded it, the smudged ink barely legible. "My dearest Clara, if you're reading this, I'm in trouble. Followed the wrong trail. Cave system, deeper than expected. Coordinates, I love you always." The words hit like a lightning bolt. I buried my face in the jacket, inhaling the faint trace of Michael's cologne mingled with the earthy decay of time. The dog nudged me with his nose, pulling me from my haze. Beneath his thick fur was a worn collar, its tag missing. Recognition sparked. 4 years ago, a stray shepherd had shadowed rescue teams during the search. I hadn't thought much of it then, but now, staring into those intelligent eyes, I wondered just how much this dog knew, and whether he was here to lead me somewhere I wasn't ready to go. The dog sat by my side as I stared at the note, its water-damaged words filling me with equal parts hope and dread. Michael was out there, maybe alive, maybe not. But this dog, this mysterious shepherd, seemed to carry a purpose that was impossible to ignore. I reached out to scratch his ears. "Do you know something?" I murmured. He tilted his head, his gaze never leaving mine, then stood and walked to the edge of the porch. He looked back at me expectantly. A chill ran through me. For 4 years, I had tried to let go. I had buried my grief as best as I could, but now, the jacket, the note, the dog, they stirred something inside me. A flicker of hope, small but persistent. Grabbing my phone, I called Detective Paul Ramirez, the man who had led the investigation into Michael's disappearance. He'd retired last year but had given me his number in case I ever needed anything. The phone rang 4 times before his gruff voice answered. "Clara, what's going on?" "Paul, I found something." My voice trembled. "Michael's jacket?" "The dog brought it to me." There was a pause, heavy with disbelief. "His jacket? After 4 years?" "It's here. There's a note inside, coordinates, but it's smudged. I think it might be a clue." Paul exhaled sharply. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Don't go anywhere." Hanging up, I turned back to the dog. He was watching me, his tail flicking slightly. It was as if he understood the gravity of the moment. "You've been waiting, haven't you?" I asked softly, waiting for the right time. Paul arrived faster than I expected, pulling up in his old truck, his expression grim yet curious. The dog trotted to meet him, sniffing his outstretched hand cautiously. "Well, I'll be damned," Paul muttered. "It's the mountain dog, the one the search teams used to talk about." "You've seen him before?" I asked, surprised. "Not in person, but everyone around here knows about him. They call him the Ridge Keeper. Said he showed up during searches, but no one could catch him. Some thought he was just a legend." Paul examined the jacket with his detective's eye. "This hasn't been out in the elements for 4 years. Maybe a year tops." His words hit me like a thunderclap. "Then that means," Paul nodded, "wherever Michael was, This jacket was protected for a long time, and now someone or something wants us to find him. The dog barked, startling us. He trotted to the edge of the porch, looking back at us with urgency. Paul exchanged a glance with me. Looks like he wants us to follow. Without hesitation, I grabbed my hiking boots, flashlight, and the jacket. The dog led the way, his pace steady but purposeful. Paul and I trailed behind, the weight of the past 4 years hanging over us like the dark clouds gathering above. The forest was alive with whispers, branches swaying, leaves rustling. The air felt heavy, as though it carried secrets waiting to be revealed. The dog moved with certainty, weaving through the dense underbrush as though he knew exactly where we needed to go. "Clara," Paul said after a while, his voice cautious, "are you sure about this? Sometimes the answers we find aren't the ones we want." I looked at the dog ahead, his tail a steady beacon in the gloom. "I have to know, Paul. I've waited too long for this." We pressed on, deeper into the woods, toward whatever truth the Ridgekeeper wanted us to uncover. The forest thickened as we followed the dog deeper into the unknown. Each step seemed to carry us further from the world we knew, into a realm of shadows and secrets. The Ridgekeeper led with unwavering confidence, his every movement filled with purpose. The tension between Paul and me was palpable, neither of us willing to voice the fears growing with each passing moment. The dog stopped abruptly, sniffing the ground before veering off the main trail. We followed as he led us through a dense thicket of brambles and mountain laurel, their branches clawing at our clothes. Paul muttered something under his breath, but I kept moving, focused on the dog. Then we saw it. Half hidden by a curtain of ivy was a rocky outcrop with a dark opening at its base. It wasn't marked on any maps we had used during the original search. The dog stood by the entrance, his ears perked, tail wagging slightly, as though he'd finally reached his destination. "This isn't on any of the old mining maps," Paul said, frowning as he scanned the area. "All the entrances were supposed to be sealed decades ago." I stepped closer, my flashlight illuminating the jagged opening. The air emanating from within was cool and damp, carrying the faint scent of earth and stone. My pulse quickened. Paul crouched by the entrance, running his fingers over the rocks. "Fresh marks," he observed. "Someone's been here recently. Look at this." He pointed to faint scratches along the edges. "Tool marks, modern ones." A cold realization settled over me. "Michael was here," I whispered, clutching the jacket tighter. Paul straightened, his expression unreadable. If he was, someone might not have wanted him to leave. The dog barked sharply, drawing our attention back to him. He had already stepped into the cave, his form partially swallowed by the darkness. He looked back at us, his amber eyes reflecting the beam of my flashlight. "He wants us to go in," I said, taking a hesitant step forward. Paul caught my arm. "Clara, wait. This could be dangerous. We don't know what's in there." I met his gaze, the weight of my determination hardening my resolve. "Michael's in there. I can feel it. I can't turn back now." Paul sighed heavily, pulling out his flashlight. "Then let's be smart about this. Stay close, and don't touch anything unless you have to." Together, we followed the dog into the cave. The darkness enveloped us, the walls narrowing as the passage descended. My flashlight revealed fragments of old mining equipment, rusted rails, a collapsed support beam, and long-forgotten tools. The deeper we went, the more the cave seemed to come alive, the faint echoes of dripping water and shifting rocks playing tricks on my ears. The dog moved with quiet assurance, his nails clicking against the stone floor. At one point he paused, sniffing the ground before leading us into a larger chamber. My flashlight caught a glimpse of something that made my breath hitch, a climbing rope, frayed but intact, tied to a rusted anchor drilled into the rock. Paul inspected the rope, his brow furrowed. "This is recent, no more than a year old." I traced the rope with my flashlight, following it to a vertical shaft in the chamber's center. My heart pounded as I peered over the edge, the beam of light disappearing into the abyss below. "This is where he went," I said, my voice trembling. Paul nodded grimly. "If we go down there, we'd better be prepared." The dog stood by the shaft, his tail wagging slowly. He barked once, the sound echoing through the chamber, urging us forward. Taking a deep breath, I tightened my grip on the flashlight and stepped closer to the edge. Whatever lay below, it was time to find out. The vertical shaft gaped before us, its black depths both inviting and foreboding. My flashlight beam disappeared into the void, swallowed by the secrets of the earth. The Ridge Keeper stood resolutely at the edge, his gaze fixed on me as though urging me forward. Paul tightened the straps on his backpack, his expression grim. "If we're doing this, we need to be careful. One wrong move down there, and we could be stuck." I nodded, my fingers trembling as I adjusted the climbing harness we'd found near the cave entrance. The frayed ropes and anchors were unsettling, but they were all we had. "Michael's been down here," I said softly, the thought both terrifying and hopeful. "We need to follow him." Paul glanced at the dog, who was pacing near the edge, his tail wagging slightly. "I don't know how, but it feels like this dog knows more than we do." I couldn't disagree. Every step of this journey felt orchestrated, as though the Ridge Keeper had been waiting for years to guide us here. Taking a deep breath, I secured the rope and began my descent. The cold air wrapped around me as I lowered myself into the shaft. The stone walls were rough, damp to the touch, and the echoes of my movements bounced eerily around me. Paul followed close behind, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The Ridge Keeper amazed me as he moved effortlessly, leaping between narrow ledges that my flashlight barely illuminated. He paused now and then, looking back at us, ensuring we were following. After what felt like an eternity, the shaft opened into a cavern. My boots hit solid ground, and I exhaled shakily. The first thing I noticed was the silence, deep and profound, broken only by the faint drip of water somewhere in the distance. "Look at this," Paul said, his flashlight sweeping the chamber. Massive crystalline formations glittered like a field of stars. The air was thick with the scent of minerals, almost metallic. "I've never seen anything like it." I stepped closer to one of the crystals, mesmerized by its size and structure. "Michael talked about formations like this," I whispered. "He said there were anomalies in the geological surveys, things that didn't make sense." The Ridge Keeper barked, snapping me out of my thoughts. He stood near a narrow tunnel leading deeper into the cavern. His urgency was palpable. Paul frowned. "He's leading us further in. Whatever Michael found, it wasn't just these crystals." I followed the dog, my heart pounding. The tunnel twisted and turned, the air growing cooler with each step. Eventually we entered another chamber, and my breath caught in my throat. A campsite. There was a tent, half collapsed but intact, surrounded by equipment. A lantern sat on a makeshift table next to a stack of notebooks. I rushed forward, my hands trembling as I picked up one of the notebooks. It was Michael's handwriting. "Day 142, I read aloud, my voice shaking. "The formations defy explanation. Energy readings are unprecedented. I think this could revolutionize energy storage. But there's something else. I've seen movement in the tunnels. I'm not alone." Paul scanned the area with his flashlight. "Clara, this isn't just a campsite. This was his base. He was working down here." I turned to the Ridge Keeper, who stood near another passage, whining softly. He pawed at the ground as if urging me forward. My hands tightened around Michael's notebook. "He's still alive, I know it." Paul placed a hand on my shoulder. "Let's keep moving. Let's stay close. Whatever's down here might not just be nature." The Ridge Keeper led the way, his steps quick and deliberate. The air grew heavier, the sound of rushing water growing louder as we ventured further into the unknown. And then, in the distance, I heard it. A faint, haunting melody. A song I hadn't heard in years. Louis Armstrong's "What a Wonderful World." It was the song Michael had hummed to me the morning he disappeared. The faint strains of What a Wonderful World seemed to float through the cavern, distorted yet unmistakable. My heart clenched, each note a cruel reminder of Michael's voice humming that same tune the morning he disappeared. The ridgekeeper froze, his ears twitching as he listened. His head turned toward the sound, and without hesitation he began to trot deeper into the cave. Paul and I exchanged uneasy glances. "That song," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "He used to sing it to me, the morning he left." Paul nodded, his flashlight beam bouncing off the rough walls as we hurried to follow the dog. "I don't know how it's possible, but if it's here, we're getting closer." The passage narrowed, forcing us to move single file. The sound of rushing water grew louder, mingling with the ghostly melody. The dog stopped suddenly, his body tense, and let out a low growl. Ahead, the passage widened into another chamber. Stepping inside, I was struck by the sight of modern equipment scattered across the crystalline floor: geological tools, sampling bags, a portable radio emitting the faint song, and what looked like fresh footprints in the dust. But what caught my eye most was a climbing harness, partially buried under a pile of fallen rocks. Paul knelt to examine it, his expression grim. "This is recent. It's been used." My knees buckled as I reached for the harness. My fingers brushed against something tucked beneath it. A familiar scarf. Michael's scarf, the one I'd knitted for him years ago. "He's been here," I whispered, clutching the fabric to my chest. "Not just years ago. Recently." Paul stood, his face tight with concern. "If this was his, he's not alone down here." The ridgekeeper barked sharply, his tail pointing to a narrow crevice on the far side of the chamber. Paul's flashlight revealed another dark opening, partially obscured by mining equipment. The dog approached, pawing at the entrance, his eyes pleading with me. "We don't have time to wait," I said, determination hardening my voice. "If he's alive, he could be hurt. He needs us." Paul sighed, pulling out his GPS. "We're deeper than we've ever been in the system, Clara. If something happens—" "I know the risks," I interrupted, already stepping toward the crevice. "But he's here. I can feel it." The dog barked again, his urgency spurring us forward. We squeezed through the narrow opening, the air growing colder and heavier. The sound of rushing water became deafening, and then we saw it. A subterranean river cutting through the cavern, its dark waters glinting in the dim light of our flashlights. And on the opposite bank there was another tent, newer, cleaner. Someone was living here. "Michael," I called, my voice cracking as it echoed off the cavern walls. But the only response was the dog's low growl. From behind us, a new sound emerged, heavy footsteps, and the unmistakable metallic click of a firearm being cocked. "Well," a voice drawled, smooth and menacing. "Look who finally found her way to the truth." We spun around, our flashlights landing on a man standing in the shadows, flanked by two others. His face was half hidden by the brim of his hat, but it gleamed with malice. Behind him, the faint hum of the radio still played. "What a wonderful world." "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The man chuckled, stepping closer. "We've been waiting for you, Dr. Clara Morgan. Your husband mentioned you'd be clever enough to find this place." Paul shifted, his hand instinctively moving toward his belt, but one of the men raised a gun. "Don't try anything stupid," the leader warned. His gaze flicked to the ridgekeeper, who was now baring his teeth. "And call off your dog before he gets hurt." I stared at the man, my mind racing. "Where is Michael?" I demanded, my fear eclipsed by desperation. The man smirked. "Let's just say he's been cooperative once we gave him the right incentives. You'll see him soon enough. But first, you're going to come with us." The ridgekeeper growled louder, stepping between me and the men. His fur bristled, his body a wall of defiance. The leader gestured toward the dog. "That mutt's been a thorn in our side for years. Looks like he finally led you here." Paul's flashlight beam flicked across the men, and I caught a glimmer of something in the shadows, a faint movement like a figure hidden behind the rocks. My breath caught as hope flared. Michael. The Ridgekeeper lunged, teeth flashing, as chaos erupted in the cavern. The Ridgekeeper's leap was a blur of fur and fury. His powerful frame collided with the leader, sending the man stumbling backward. The gun clattered to the ground, and the cavern erupted into chaos. "Run!" Paul shouted, his flashlight sweeping the chamber. He lunged for the dropped firearm, his years of training kicking in. The two other men moved to intercept, but the Ridgekeeper turned on them, his growl reverberating through the cavern. I didn't run. My eyes darted to the shadows where I'd seen movement moments before. "Michael!" I screamed, desperate. A voice, weak but unmistakable, answered from the far side of the chamber. "Clara!" My legs moved before I could think, carrying me toward the sound. Paul's shouts and the commotion behind me faded into the background. I slid down a slope of loose rocks, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly until it caught a figure slumped against the cavern wall. "Michael?" I whispered, tears streaming down my face as I dropped to my knees beside him. He looked thinner, older, his face lined with exhaustion, but his eyes, those same bright, intelligent eyes, lit up at the sight of me. "Clara, you found me." I cupped his face, my hands trembling. I never stopped looking. Before we could say more, the chaos behind us surged closer. One of the armed men had regained his footing and was barreling toward us. I shielded Michael instinctively, but before the man could reach us, the Ridgekeeper appeared, snarling and leaping at him with ferocious precision. Paul's voice rang out, "Stay down." A gunshot echoed through the chamber, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. The man fell, his weapon skittering across the rocks. The leader, now armed with a knife, charged at Paul. They grappled in the flickering light of our flashlights. Paul managed to knock the blade from his hand, but the struggle was far from over. "Clara?" Michael rasped, gripping my arm. "You have to go. They'll come for you next." "I'm not leaving you," I said fiercely, tears burning my eyes. "They're after my research," Michael said, his voice urgent despite his weakness. "They want the crystals, the energy data. You can't let them have it." The Ridgekeeper returned to our side, his coat matted with dust and dirt, his eyes burning with determination. He nudged Michael gently, as if urging him to stand. "Can you move?" I asked, my heart pounding. Michael nodded weakly. "I'll try." With the dog on one side and me on the other, we helped him to his feet. The sound of more footsteps echoed from the tunnels, the reinforcements the men had been waiting for. Paul turned toward us, his face set with grim resolve. "You need to go," he said. "I'll hold them off as long as I can." "Paul, no," I protested. He shook his head. "I've got this. Just get out of here and take Michael to safety." The Ridgekeeper barked sharply, pulling at my sleeve as if to say, "There's no time to argue." Clutching Michael's arm, I followed the dog toward another tunnel. The passage sloped upward, the sound of rushing water fading as we ascended. Michael stumbled, his breathing labored, but the Ridgekeeper stayed close, pressing against him to keep him steady. "Clara," Michael murmured as we climbed, "I didn't think I'd see you again." "Don't talk like that," I said, tears streaming down my face. "We're getting out of here. All of us." The dog led us to a narrow ledge overlooking the cavern below. From this vantage point, I could see Paul standing his ground against the men. The sound of more gunfire echoed through the chamber, and my chest tightened. "We have to keep moving," I said, my voice breaking. The Ridgekeeper barked once, his tail wagging as he led us higher. The air grew fresher, the oppressive weight of the underground giving way to the promise of escape. Finally, we saw it. A faint light ahead, filtering through a small opening in the rock. "Almost there," I whispered, gripping Michael tighter. With one final push, we emerged into the open air. The storm from earlier had passed, and the moon cast a pale glow over the mountains. The Ridgekeeper turned to us, his eyes filled with a quiet triumph. But we weren't safe yet. Behind us, shouts echoed from the cave. The men were still coming. The dog barked again, louder this time, and sprinted toward a ridge overlooking the valley. He stopped at the edge, looking back at us, his posture commanding us to follow. I hesitated, fear gripping me, but Michael squeezed my hand. "Trust him," he said, his voice soft but certain. We followed the ridge keeper onto the ridge, the vast expanse of the forest stretching out below us. Somewhere in the distance, the wail of sirens cut through the night, rescue teams, alerted by Paul's earlier call. The men burst from the cave just as the ridge keeper let out a deep, resonant howl that echoed across the mountains. The sound was soon joined by others, howls from the forest below, wild and unrelenting. The men froze, their bravado faltering as the night seemed to come alive with the sound of the wilderness rising to our defense. And then, out of the shadows, came movement. More dogs. They appeared one by one, their eyes glinting in the moonlight, surrounding us in a silent, protective circle. The ridge keeper stood at their center, his chest puffed with pride. The men hesitated, fear overtaking them. With a final bark from the ridge keeper, they turned and fled back into the cave, disappearing into the darkness. Michael collapsed against me, his strength spent. "We made it," he whispered, his voice a mix of relief and disbelief. The ridge keeper approached, pressing his nose to Michael's hand. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to hope. The mountains had kept their secrets long enough. Now it was time to bring Michael home. The first rays of dawn broke over the mountains as we stumbled onto the main trail. The ridge keeper trotted ahead, his tail high, guiding us toward safety. Michael leaned heavily on me, his exhaustion evident, but his grip on my arm was firm, as if afraid I might vanish if he let go. In the distance, flashing lights came into view, rescue vehicles parked along the trailhead. Figures moved toward us, their voices calling out. Paul's call for backup had worked. Help had arrived. As we emerged from the forest, the rescue team rushed to meet us. One of them, a young paramedic, gently eased Michael onto a stretcher. His pale face broke into a small smile as he whispered, "You really came for me." Tears streamed down my cheeks as I kissed his forehead. "I'll always come for you." Paul appeared moments later, limping slightly but alive. His face was streaked with dirt and his jacket was torn, but his eyes sparkled with relief. "You made it," he said, his voice gruff but warm. "We wouldn't have without him," I said, gesturing toward the ridge keeper. The dog sat calmly beside me, his eyes scanning the scene as if ensuring we were all safe. Paul knelt beside him, his hand resting on the dog's head. "You're a damn miracle, you know that?" The ridge keeper wagged his tail once, his demeanor proud but humble. It was as if he understood the weight of what he had done. Michael was whisked away to the nearest hospital, and I rode with him, clutching his hand the entire time. The ridge keeper followed the rescue vehicles, his steady presence a reminder of the incredible journey that had brought us to this moment. In the weeks that followed, the truth of Michael's disappearance unraveled. His research had uncovered a mineral formation unlike anything ever documented, crystals capable of storing immense amounts of energy. A shadowy corporation had learned of his findings and orchestrated his kidnapping, trapping him in the cave to force his cooperation. But Michael had resisted. For years, he had survived in the cave system, evading his captors and documenting his findings in secret. The ridge keeper, it turned out, had been his only companion, a silent guardian who ventured beyond the caves to bring help. The rescue team recovered Michael's equipment, along with the USB drive containing his research. The information exposed the corporation's crimes, leading to arrests and a cascade of justice. Michael's discovery was handed over to scientists who ensured it would benefit the world, rather than line the pockets of the corrupt. 1 year later, life had finally returned to a new kind of normal. Michael's health improved steadily, though the scars of his ordeal would never fully fade. The Ridgekeeper, officially named Max, had become an inseparable part of our family. He patrolled our home each night, ever the watchful guardian. But his days were filled with contentment and love. On the anniversary of the day Max brought me Michael's jacket, we gathered on our back porch, the mountains bathed in the golden light of sunset. Michael sat beside me, his hand in mine, as Max lay at our feet, his head resting on the very jacket that had started it all. "You know," Michael said softly, "I used to dream of this moment. Sitting here with you, Max, by our side, it kept me going." I turned to him, my heart swelling. "We found you because you never gave up. Because Max never gave up. And because you never stopped looking," he added, his voice full of gratitude. "Even when the world told you to let go." Max lifted his head, his tail wagging as if he understood. I leaned down to scratch behind his ears. "You're the real hero, aren't you, Max?" He barked once, a sharp, joyful sound that echoed across the valley. The mountains stood tall and silent, their secrets now uncovered. The trail that had once taken Michael away from me had led him back. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we sat together, our little family whole again, ready to face whatever the future might bring. Some stories, I realized, don't end, they simply find new beginnings. And as Max lay his head in my lap, I knew ours was just beginning. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you won't miss any of our latest videos. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below. Thank you all for taking the time to watch, and see you in the next video.